This is a short lesson on how to calculate standard deviation. Standard deviation is basically the distance away from the average, so it requires the average in the formula. I have two different formulas I'm going to use, two different sets. The first set here is if I have no frequency table. And the other set obviously is if I have a frequency table. And when I look at the two formulas, the frequency table has an F in it in the different formulas for both standard deviation and for average. And the one without a frequency table, there is no F. Okay, so the sigma notation here, the lowercase sigma, is standard deviation. It is a summation of x minus the average squared divided by n. And then so it has the average in the formula, which means I'm going to need to calculate the average along the way. Same as the other standard deviation formula for a frequency table. It has average in it, which means I'm going to have to calculate the average along the way. Two different sets of formulas depending if I have a frequency table or not. And we'll do an example of each. The first example is I just have 6 numbers. No frequency table required, so I'm going to simply just use my no frequency table formulas. First thing I'm going to do is organize it a little bit. So I'm going to create a column called X. Okay? And I'll put my numbers in my X column. I can put them in order from lowest to highest, or I can just put them down the way I see it. It doesn't really matter. Okay? Now I'm going to have to calculate my average. Average is mu equals summation of x divided by n. So I might as well sum up my my x values along the way. So I'm going to add them up. I have 10, I have 15, I have 10, I have 25, I have 30 when I add them all up. So my average is going to be 30 divided by, and there were 6 terms, so my average is 5. Look at my standard deviation formula. It asks me to take my x values and subtract from the average. So I'll do that in my table. I want to take x values, subtract the average, set up a column for that. So I'm going to take each of the x values and subtract away the average. So it's going to go 4 subtract 5, which equals -1. Then I'll do 6 subtract 5, which equals 1. 3 subtract 5, which is -2. 2 subtract 5, which is -3. 7 subtract 5, which is 2. 8 subtract 5, which is 3. I'm taking every one of these x values and subtracting away the average that I had previously calculated. The next thing on the formula is I have to take my x minus my average, and I got to square it. So I'm going to set up a separate column, x minus my average squared. Okay? So I take the values I had, and I'm going to square them. -1 squared is +1. 1 squared is 1. -2 squared is +4. -3 squared is 9. 2 squared is 4. 3 squared is 9 again. Okay? And that gives me my x minus my average squared. I can now add those up because, again, the formula asks me to sum up my x minus my average squared. So I'm going to do that, and that's going to give me 28. Okay? So my standard deviation, which is the square root of the summation of x minus my average squared divided by n, is going to equal the square root of 28, and there were 6 terms divided by 6. So I'm going to do 28 divided by 6. Okay, so you're going to equal the square root of 4.67, and I can square root that, and it's going to give me 2.16. That is my standard deviation. Okay, without a frequency table. You set up your columns, let your table do all the work for you, and you just put the numbers into the formula. The second example is if I have a frequency table. Now when I have a frequency table, I'm going to be using the formulas average equals summation of xf over summation of f, and I'll be using standard deviation equals the square root of f x minus my average, I'll try that one again. Standard deviation equals the square root of the summation of f x minus the average squared divided by summation of f. Okay, so I'm going to again let the table do the work, but knowing that these two formulas are the ones I'm going to have to use because I'm using a frequency table. So I have my x, I have my f, my frequency of how often the numbers 1 appear, how often the number 2 appear, and so on. So I'm going to set up some additional columns. I'm going to need the xf column to help calculate my average. I'm going to need to have a column for x minus my average, just like previously. I'll need to have a column x minus my average squared. And lastly, in the formula, I have to take my x minus my average squared and multiply it by the frequency. So I'm going to set up a column of that. I have my frequency multiplied by my x minus my average squared. So I'm going to start filling it out here. I have xf, multiply the two together, x times f, which is 4, x times f, which is 12, 30, 24, and 20. So I'm going to add those all up. So I'm going to get 50, 70, 80. I'm going to get 90 when I add those all up. Okay, I need to have my summation of f, which I add up all these values, 10, 20, I'm going to have 30. So I know my average is the summation of xf, which was 90, divided by my summation of f, which was 30. My average is 3. Then I can start taking each of the x values and subtract away the average. So it's going to go 1 minus the average of 3. So 1 minus 3 is negative 2. 2 minus 3 is negative 1. 3 minus 3 is 0. 4 minus 3 is 1. 5 minus 3 is 2. Take my x minus my average squared. So squaring these values. I'm taking this column and I'm just going to do a new thing to it, which is squaring. 4, 1, 0, 1, 4. Take my x minus my average squared, so the previous column, and now multiply it by their respective frequencies, f. Okay, so I'm going to take 4, multiply it by 4, which gives me 16. 1 times 6, which is 6. 0 times 10, which is 0. 1 times 6, which is 6. 4 times 4, which is 16. Then I want to add them all up, because the formula asks me to summate my f minus x, my x minus my average squared. So I'm going to add them all up. So I'm going to have 22 plus 22, which is 44. So my standard deviation, the table that did all the work for me, equals the square root. This entire column here was a column from my table, which would be 44, divided by the summation of f, which I had previously found, which is 30. So now I can divide 44 divided by 30, okay, which equals square root of 1.47, and then I can square root that, which will give me a standard deviation of 1.21. Okay? Two different ways to find standard deviation. If you have a frequency table, you need to use a frequency table formula along with the average formula for a frequency table. And if you don't have a frequency table, you can just simply use the its proper formula as well. This is a lesson on calculating standard deviation brought to you by Energized Math. Thank you very much.